I was thrust onto this planet with great force on a cold December morning, following a 30-hour labor suffered by my mother, Heidi Sue Thomas. This was the day my tragic childhood began. My birth was not to be the great family celebration it should have been. Alas, quite the opposite. My mother was a young 20-year-old woman, a rebel for her own cause. She met her first love, my father, Christopher Jason Gilligan, in a conservative club in Manchester during the summer of 1968, while my father was on a 2-week leave from the RAF. They fell in love and within 3 months were officially engaged. My mother was born Heidi Sue Thomas, 1947, in Denton, Manchester. She was born without emotion and did not feel for the needs of others, only for herself. She was incapable of feeling. It was not something that came naturally to her. She could not identify with the word sympathy at all. I was to find out much later in life, during my 30s, some very truthful hurts about my mother. She was admitted to a psychiatric ward in her late teens. She was an uncontrollable, destructive force and full of hate for everyone. She poisoned everything good that came into contact with her. A true destroyer of good. She never felt remorse for her actions and was a human being that could not be reasoned with at all. So to me, not really human at all. If diagnosed in this day and age, she would more than likely have been diagnosed a sociopath for sure. However, this was the 1960s, and it was a completely different world back then, with a completely different set of rules. Shame was something no family wanted to suffer, least of all my grandma and granddad Thomas, my mother's parents. They were such proud people, churchgoers every Sunday. Granddad Thomas was a scout leader and a factory foreman. My grandmother a housewife and full-time mother. Therefore, they did what many families did during that period to cover up their shame. Dealt with it quietly, so as not to draw attention upon themselves from the rest of the community. They were the first family in their street to own a car, Morris Minor, I believe. To own one car was a luxury in those days, unlike today where there are multiple cars per family. The streets were so much quieter, and children could play safely on the road. That is how rare it was to see a car. My grandparents bought their first house for £2,500, a large sum in those days. My mother was an extremely attractive woman with dark, sultry looks and deep brown eyes. Moreover, she knew it too. She used this to her advantage to get what she wanted and get away with anything she needed to. My mother had a normal childhood and was brought up by fairly strict parents. They were a typical nuclear family. My mother had a brother called Jeffrey, and they were 10 years apart in age. They were dressed, fed, and cared for well. Mother had a good education and went to grammar school. She would receive a good clip around the ear if she was out of line by her father, which was also pretty normal back then. At the time of their meeting, my mother and father were both 19 years old. But the law at the time stated that any couple wishing to marry without parental consent had to be 21 years old. My father's parents were against the marriage, as they thought Heidi was not good enough for their son. Rumors had spilled out into the village concerning her promiscuous antics and general behavior. Her parents could no longer control their own daughter, and so Granddad Thomas would knock her from one end of the kitchen to the other, and still she would smile back, finding it all hilarious. He did not beat her often. However, when she was totally out of control, he would hit her about the house. They reached the point of sheer frustration with my mother, and eventually were happy to relinquish all responsibility and pass her on to Christopher, my father. However, Christopher's parents had knowledge of Heidi's previous stint in the psychiatric ward due to some investigations carried out when their own concerns about Heidi were raised. Grandma and Granddad George, Christopher's parents, paid a visit to the local doctors, and behind closed doors, they asked my mother's physician for some insight into what was wrong with her. They stated that their son was about to marry Heidi, and that they knew something was not right. The public outbursts, uncontrollable temper, unreasonable behavior, and unwarranted hate. The physician, of course, was not at liberty to discuss patient information. However, he advised Christopher's parents to tell their son that when it gets difficult, then he should just run the other way and do not look back.